I am delighted to be back with you and grateful for the opportunity to share this time as together we explore racism in America, the history we didn't learn in school. Today, we're focusing on part 2 of 6, Slavery by Another Name, our country's history from the time of Reconstruction following the Civil War through the early 20th century. It's a pivotal period and one that has been largely hidden to many of us. As author and activist and founder of the Equal Justice Initiative, Bryan Stevenson, has said so profoundly, slavery didn't end in 1865, it evolved. There is a great deal of discussion these days on the issue of teaching a more inclusive history of our country. We hear about critical race theory, the recent AP African American Studies course, contentious school board meetings, banning books. In his book, 1984, George Orwell did not write about a year. He wrote about a mindset of oppression. And tellingly, he said, who controls the past controls the future, and who controls the present controls the past. A government in power has the ability to shape the views of the population it governs by putting out a narrative that sometimes has nothing to do with the facts. The distortion of our past is made possible through the incomplete telling of our history. In this period that we will discuss this evening, we will see the emergence of themes that continue to this day, the roots of the profound inequities that have persisted over time. Violence with impunity, much of it breathtaking, incomprehensible even. The inability of Black people in America to acquire property and build wealth, mass incarceration, and the fraught relationship between Black people and police, segregation with all its disastrous consequences, and voter suppression from the very beginning until today, tomorrow. So let's continue. Last week, we looked at the early years when slavery was created and it sustained an underclass of people in the colonies and then in the early United States. It was based on a myth of racial difference, on a belief in white supremacy and Black inferiority. The economic imperative of the slavery was essential to the colonies and then the states. And the Civil War was fought to maintain that dominance, to maintain the institution of slavery. At the end of the war, there was a ray of hope for a more perfect union in Reconstruction. But continuing pressure resulted in a decision made in the election of 1876, whereby Rutherford B. Hayes was named president if he would promise to end Reconstruction, and he did. And so the federal troops were withdrawn, and the Southern leadership that had been in place prior to the start of the Civil War and during the war was restored. But defeat in war had intensified the drive to resubjugate those people who had been owned as slaves, to reassert white supremacy, the belief that white people are inherently superior to Black people and therefore rightfully the dominant group in society as the governing principle in the South. So as we turn to this period, we see expressions of the post-war system of white supremacy included horrific violence as a societal norm, the replacement of slave labor with the agricultural economic system known as sharecropping, repressive governmental actions known as Black codes, and the legal infrastructure of Jim Crow laws that created and enforced segregation that ushered in a century-long era of racial hierarchy, lynching, white superiority, and bigotry. While Reconstruction era violence was most frequent in the South, Negroes living in the North and West also faced racially motivated violence and continuing bigotry. White officials in the North and West similarly rejected racial equality, codified racial discrimination, and occasionally embraced the same tactic of violent racial control that was seen in the South. An editorial in the Cincinnati Enquirer, published a few days after the surrender at Appomattox, read, "Slavery is dead. The Negro is not. There is our misfortune." Over the century that this racial caste system reigned, lynching became the weapon of choice and a technique of enforcing racial exploitation. Between Reconstruction and World War II, thousands of African Americans were lynched, often in public acts of torture that traumatized Black people across the country. Reconstruction is the prologue to that story. The thousands of Black people killed between 1865 and 1877 foreshadowed the bloodshed that would persist as the ideology of white supremacy continued to strangle the hope for equality. The Equal Justice Initiative is continuing to document the series of racial terror lynchings that took place between 1865 and 1876. This was the Reconstruction period when federal troops were charged with keeping order and ensuring that these new laws were being followed. Here is an equal justice. Oops, I have lost it, excuse me. Found it. Here is an Equal Justice Initiative graphic of the violence that took place during this period. It is a map of the United States drawn in white outline. A red dot will appear for each documented lynching. The size of the dot reflects the number of people lynched in each instance. The lower right of the screen reflects the years that these lynchings took place, and in the center is a cumulative count of the number of people killed. The graphic is compelling in the visual representation of the violence that followed the end of the Civil War. The larger dots reflected 34 documented mass lynchings that took place during that period. Here is a list of some of those by year, and in white, the city where they occurred, in red in parentheses, the number of people killed. Blue represents the number of these that took place in the state of Louisiana. In 1865, in Mobile County, Alabama, white mobs killed an estimated 138 Black people over the course of several months. The next year, in Pine Bluff, Arkansas, 24 emancipated Black men, women, and children living in a refugee camp were found hanging from trees. In Memphis that year, white mobs attacked the Black community, killing at least 46 people and destroying homes, schools, churches, and businesses. In 1868, in Milliken, Texas, an estimated 150 Black people were killed by armed white mobs. And one of the more famous events took place in Colfax, Louisiana, in 1873, when white mobs killed at least 150 Black people in violence intended to disenfranchise Black voters. Even today, there is a historical marker on the square in Colfax that reads, Colfax Riot. On this site occurred the Colfax Riot, in which 3 white men and 150 Negroes were slain. This event on April 13, 1873, marked the end of carpetbag misrule in the South. And in Vicksburg, Mississippi, in 1874, when Black residents organized to protest the removal of an elected Black sheriff, white mobs attacked and killed an estimated 50 Black people. Southern newspapers often suppressed reports of white violence targeting Black people, alleging that the stories unfairly cast the South in a bad light. In addition, the boldness and impunity with which these attacks were committed meant that many victims simply disappeared, leaving no obvious trace of their fate. The trauma of racial violence also left many Black victims and witnesses afraid to report attacks or provide testimony against the white mobs responsible. And finally, the indifference and even the complicity of local legal systems left few authorities to whom attacks could be reported, even if people were brave enough to do so. Aside from limited arrests and prosecutions undertaken by federal officials, the vast majority of white individuals and mobs that committed violence against Black people faced no consequence and had no fear of punishment. And so that is a shift that occurred once slavery came to an end, and the outrage against Black free people took this dark turn. The other change that occurred was a shift in the agricultural economic system. After the Civil War, former slaves looked for jobs and the planters needed laborers. The absence of cash on the part of those formerly enslaved or any independent credit system led to the creation of sharecropping. It is a system whereby the landlord or the planter allows a tenant to use the land in exchange for a share of the crop. This encouraged tenants to work to produce the biggest possible harvest that they could, and it ensured they would remain tied to the land and unlikely to leave for other opportunities. In the South, after the Civil War, many Black families rented land from white owners and raised cash crops such as cotton, tobacco, and rice. In many cases, the landlords or nearby merchants would lease equipment to the renters and offer seed, fertilizer, food, and other items on credit until the harvest season. At that time, the tenant and landlord or merchant would settle up, figuring out who owed whom and how much. It sounded like a very reasonable system, but high interest rates, unpredictable harvests, and unscrupulous landlords and merchants often kept tenant farm families severely indebted, requiring the debt to be carried over until the next year or the next. Laws favoring the landowners made it difficult or even illegal for sharecroppers to sell their crops to others beside their landlord, or prevented sharecroppers from moving if they were indebted to the landlord. And one of the things that this did, there was no system whereby Black people could acquire land. They could only rent land from a planter or some other landlord. And so at this point in time, more than 90% of Black Americans resided in the South by 1870, and only 1% of the more than 3 million African Americans in the region owned land. Discriminatory laws and lending practices barred Black people from land ownership for decades. And this, of course, began the denial of wealth accumulation. For so many Americans, for decades or centuries, the land they owned was at the heart of the net worth, the assets that we have. In addition to that economic system, once the war came to an end, the states began passing laws that were known as Black codes. And these were predicated on a loophole in the 13th Amendment, which read, "Neither slavery nor involuntary servitude shall exist within the United States or any place subject to their jurisdiction, except as a punishment for crime whereof the party shall have been duly convicted." And Mississippi was the first state, followed quickly by South Carolina, to enact laws that severely limited the rights and liberties of Black people. These Black codes were specific laws that applied only to Blacks. They could not testify against white people. They could not serve on juries or in state militias. They could not vote. Some states' Black code laws limited the occupations of Black people to farmer or servant, unless they paid for an annual license for some other vocation. And of course, without ready access to cash or other resources, that was a difficult hill to climb. Black orphan children and children of destitute families could be apprenticed by the state to employers until they were 18 if they were girls, or 21 if they were boys, and any proceeds from their labor would revert to the state. In many states, Black citizens were required to sign annual labor contracts. And if you were stopped on the street and could not prove that you were employed, you could be arrested, charged, tried, and incarcerated. Once incarcerated, you could be hired out at hard labor to commercial institutions. These laws declared that rebellion, arson, burglary, and assault were death penalty crimes for Black people. They were not allowed to own firearms, and they were not allowed to drink liquor. And so all of these Black codes led to the mass incarceration of Black people. The former Confederate soldiers were the police and the judges, and there was a racially separate court system that was designed to facilitate the prosecution of these Black codes. And so what resulted was a system known as convict leasing, whereby the criminal justice system would become the central institution for sustaining racial domination and hierarchy. The states could sell the labor of these incarcerated people to private interests for state profit. And so They would be hired out to mines, to railroads, to plantations, and all of the proceeds of payment for their work would revert to the state. When Alabama first implemented convict leasing in 1883, that year 10% of the state's revenue came from the proceeds of convict leasing. By the time the process was terminated in 1898, 73% of Alabama's total state revenue came from leasing convicts to private concerns. And that year, 25% of the convicts died. Because if we think back to the institution of slavery, if you owned a slave, you had a vested interest in their health and well-being. Because if a slave were to die, you would need to go through a process of purchasing another. And that could be a lengthy process. It could involve a lot of investment of cash, of money. But if you were leasing a convict from the state and they died, all you had to do was contact the state and say, send me another. And so it was a horrific system. And when it came to an end, for the most part, near the turn of the century, states reverted to the use of public chain gangs, where those who were incarcerated worked on public works projects for the benefit of the state at no income to them themselves. Ava DuVernay has produced a documentary entitled 13th that explores this aspect of the loophole in the 13th Amendment and the consequences for African American, particularly men. Not least of which was that the visuals of these chain gangs, of these convicts, intensified the public view of the stereotype of the dangerous criminal Black male. I remember taking a trip to Florida when I was 12, riding with my family. And when we got somewhere in the Carolinas, I remember seeing groups of Black men in striped uniforms chained together working along the roadside. And there would be a white man on a horse with a gun. And I cannot tell you whether I asked any questions about that, or if I asked any questions, whether I got any kind of meaningful answer from my parents, but the image has remained with me. In 1896, a Supreme Court decision known as Plessy v. Ferguson issued in the era known as Jim Crow. At the time, many states, including Louisiana, had laws that said that train cars had to have separate cars for white and Black customers. That was in violation of the 14th Amendment. And so there was a desire to challenge these racially segregated train cars in court. And a man named Homer Adolph Plessy agreed to be the plaintiff in a case aimed at testing the constitutionality of the law. He himself was of mixed race. He described himself as 7/8 Caucasian and 1/8 African blood. But the one drop rule, 1 drop of Black blood makes you Black, was in effect across the South. So on June 7th, 1892, Homer Plessy bought a ticket on a train from New Orleans that was bound for Covington, Louisiana, and he took a vacant seat in a whites-only car. After he refused to leave the car at the conductor's insistence, he was arrested and jailed. He was convicted by a New Orleans court of violating the 1890 law of segregated rail cars, and he filed a petition against the presiding judge, the Honorable John H. Ferguson, claiming that the law violated the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment. For years, the case went through the lower courts, and it finally made its way to the Supreme Court. And on May 18th, 1896, the Supreme Court delivered its verdict in Plessy v. Ferguson, and it declared separate but equal facilities constitutional. ruling that the protections of the 14th Amendment applied only to political and civil rights like voting and jury service, but not to social rights, sitting in the railroad car of your choice. In its ruling, the court denied that segregated railroad cars for Blacks were necessarily inferior. We consider the underlying fallacy of Plessy's argument, Justice Henry Brown wrote, to consist in the assumption that the enforced segregation of the two races stamps the colored race with a badge of inferiority. If this be so, it is not by reason of anything found in the act, but solely because the colored race chooses to put that construction upon it. Only because the colored race chooses to put that construction upon it. And so, the Jim Crow period, white America dealt with the inconvenience of the interaction of Black and white people by constructing a savagely enforced, formal, codified system of racial apartheid that excluded Black people almost entirely from mainstream American life. It was a system so grotesque that Nazi Germany would later take inspiration from it for its own racist policies. There were German scholars who came to the United States, who went to the University of Arkansas Law School to study the way in which US laws enforced the segregation and the separation of the races. These laws prohibited social interaction everywhere: restaurants, hotels, transportation, schools, parks, restrooms. And as time moved forward, the states began to take further action to disadvantage and disenfranchise African-American citizens. In 1890, the state of Mississippi held a constitutional convention, and it developed what became known as the Mississippi Plan. It said that in order to register to vote, potential voters had to be Mississippi residents for 2 years, pay an annual poll tax, and pass an elaborate literacy test that required the applicant to read and interpret a section of the state constitution. Now remember that nearly 25 years before, when slavery was still in effect, slaves were not taught to read or write. And in many cases, when the Black codes were passed, it was against the law for those formerly enslaved to learn to read or write. And here, 25 years later, in order to vote, you had to read and interpret the state constitution. The judges of whether or not you passed were always white people, and the selections from the Constitution that were chosen were selected by that individual and offered to a person, whether they be white or Black. There could be a different section of the Constitution to be read. None of this was done in the shadows. James Vardaman, a Democrat who would go on to become governor and then a United States senator from Mississippi, was one of the new Constitution's framers. There is no use to equivocate or lie about the matter, he said. Mississippi's Constitutional Convention of 1890 was held for no other purpose than to eliminate the N-word from politics. Let the world know it just as it is. Every other Southern state eventually adopted the Mississippi Plan. And in 1898, Louisiana held its own constitutional convention, quote, to establish the supremacy of the white race. Once the Louisiana laws were enacted, the number of registered Black voters that year dropped from more than 130,000 to 5,320, and by 1904 to 1,342. And by 1910, all of the Southern states excluded Black people from voting, despite the 14th and 15th Amendments. The legislatures and the administrations that were elected were responsible for allocating public resources for schools and for services. And those were allocated to white communities and white citizens, not Black. And these laws remained in effect until they were finally abolished by the Civil Rights Act in 1964. 75 years of this kind of treatment encoded in law. People would say, well, why didn't Black people protest? Why didn't they revolt against these laws? Why didn't they take action to assert their rights? And many tried. But the terrorism that had begun in the Reconstruction period took significant hold at this point in time. I confess that I always thought of lynching as a Black man was accused of a crime, a Black man had been arrested, but the judicial system was too slow, and a small group of white men would go to a person's home or to the jail. They would take custody of the individual, go out into the woods, throw a rope over a tree, and hang the individual. I thought that was lynching. But it was so much more. And I will tell you that the details of this are painful and difficult, and yet we need to understand the nature of control that was being exerted over the population at this point in time, in no small part because it echoes through the legacy that continues to this day. There were a significant series of terror lynchings that took place during this time period. 5,000 of them between 1877 and 1950, although that number keeps increasing as the Equal Justice Initiative does more research. The purpose of these lynchings was to demonstrate control and to send a warning to other Black people about what could happen to them if they were to step out of line. These lynchings were extrajudicial, and they would take place because of a charge of sexual assault, proven or not, force or not, minor social transgressions, a Black man not stepping off the sidewalk when passing a white person going the other way, a Black man standing too close to a white woman, an allegation of a crime. And they featured large crowds, often thousands of people who would gather to witness these events. And the crowds would frequently include elected officials and prominent citizens. They were bold public acts that implicated the entire community. And for all intents and purposes, there were no legal consequences. And they traumatized the Black community. And there are those who say that this violence in ways is embedded in the DNA of Black people in our country even today. 99% of the perpetrators escaped punishment. And it took more than 200 attempts for Congress to pass a law declaring that lynching was unconstitutional. 200 attempts. These are difficult. They are some images of these public spectacle lynchings. On the left, the sepia-toned image is actually a postcard, because when these lynchings were advertised, and they were, professional photographers would come to the scene and take photographs and make postcards that they would sell to the spectators, that they could send home to their family and friends who had not been able to attend. And so that image on the left is Jesse Washington, lynched in Waco, Texas in 1916. And the text written at the bottom of the postcard reads, "This is the barbecue we had last night. My picture is to the left under a cross. Your son, Joe." One of the more troubling images that I have seen represented numerous times is the one, the upper center, of a young girl with a tentative smile on her face, looking up at the hanging corpse of a Black man who had been lynched. The upper right is Will Brown, who was lynched during a period known as Red Summer in Omaha, Nebraska in 1919. And after being tortured and shot and dragged behind a police car to the pyre, his corpse was set on fire. And look at the people who are watching. These are well-dressed white citizens. To what end? And the lower picture is something that frequently happened on a Friday or a Saturday night when couples would go out for an evening of socialization and entertainment in the parks in their towns and be entertained and amused and share convivial time together under the bodies of hanging Black men. One particular case is that of John Hartfield. On June 26, 1919, John Hartfield was lynched in Ellisville, Mississippi. It was a small town, a population of about 1,000 people. He fell in love with a white woman in town and she with him, and they wanted to be together, but they knew that that would not happen in Ellisville. So he left and he went to East St. Louis, Missouri, where he got a job and worked to save money for 2 years until he had enough money saved to go and get her and take him with her to Missouri. When word got out that he was returning, the sheriff arranged that he would be met at the city limits and shot in the shoulder. He was taken to a physician's office and the doctor was advised to keep John Hartfield alive long enough for him to be lynched. And so the newspaper that evening read, "John Hartfield will be lynched by Ellisville mob at 5 o'clock this afternoon." Governor Bilbo said he is powerless to prevent it. Thousands of people are flocking into Ellisville to attend the event. Sheriff and authorities are powerless to prevent it. Powerless to prevent it. He was hung. He was tortured. Body parts were cut off and distributed as souvenirs to people in the crowd. White men had been deputized to bring guns and they fired 2,000 bullets at his body, one of which severed the rope by which he hung, and when his corpse fell, it was set on fire. 10,000 men, women brought their children to this event. There were people selling lemonade. The participants brought picnics. It is incomprehensible. And yet, it occurred again and again and again. The Equal Justice Initiative famously said that the last documented lynching occurred in 1952, but I would contend that there have been others since then. And part of the consequences, in addition to this knowledge being embedded in people's minds, in the counties where most of these lynchings took place, even today, voter registration rates of Black citizens are 30% lower than in surrounding communities. The message was so clear. And so all of this situation and circumstance created an environment that led to what is known as the Great Migration, which occurred between 1916 and 1970, when 6 million African Americans left the South and moved to cities in the Northeast, Midwest, and West. They went for better living conditions, less repressive laws, and more economic opportunity, and to escape the terror. When this began, it was during World War I, and there was a significant shortage of workers in the North and West. The war production was amping up. Immigration from Europe had stopped. The United States had actually admitted 25 million European immigrants into the US between 1871 and 1915, but that stopped. That supply of workers stopped when the war began. And men had gone off to fight in the war. So churches in the South formed migration clubs. Northern businesses employed agents to go recruit workers to come from the South. And between 1910 and 1920, the African-American population of New York increased by 66%, Chicago by 148%, Philadelphia by 500%, and Detroit by 611%. And one of the incredible things that happened during this period of time was that a formerly all-white community in New York called Harlem, by the 1920s, it housed 200,000 African Americans, and what developed became known as the Harlem Renaissance, an amazing period of great art and music as the African Americans moved to that community. However, when the war came to an end, there was an eventual labor surplus, and as the largely white veterans returned home, there was conflict over who would be employed. Labor unions refused to admit African Americans as members, and so the situation became dire. And during the summer of 1919, known as the Red Summer, there were race riots in Chicago and 25 other cities. The last event to describe during this time period occurred in a place called Greenwood, a suburb of Tulsa, Oklahoma, known as the Black Wall Street. There was a lot of tension between Greenwood and Tulsa itself. Greenwood was home to nationally renowned Black lawyers, doctors, judges, intellectuals, and there was tension there. In that summer of 1919, the Red Summer, there had been a lynching of a Black man in Tulsa, and memory of that was still there when on May 31st, 1921, a young Black shoeshine boy named Dick Rowland left his shoeshine area because he needed to go to the bathroom. And there was only one building in the city of Tulsa that had a restroom that Black people could use. It was the Drexel building. And as you can imagine, that restroom was at the very upper reaches of the Drexel building. And so Dick Rowland got on the elevator that was operated by a young white girl named Sarah Page. When the elevator arrived at the top floor, Sarah Page screamed and Dick Rowland ran. It was determined afterwards that he had probably bumped into her or stepped on her foot, but her scream sent him running. And the newspaper that day had a headline, "Nab Negro for Attacking Girl in Elevator," and ran an ominous editorial, "To Lynch Negro Tonight." Some Black veterans from Greenwood, military veterans, came to surround the courthouse where Dick Rowland was being held in the jail. And a group of 150 white men gathered, armed men. A shot was fired. The sheriff deputized all of the white men who marched on Greenwood, shooting people and setting fires as they went. Some of the white men commandeered aircraft at the nearby airport and dropped kerosene bombs on Greenwood. And for 48 hours, the fires raged. When it was over, 85 city blocks looked like that picture. 800 people were injured and more than 300 killed. The city of Greenwood was never rebuilt. And the archives of the Tulsa Tribune, the newspaper that day, May 31st, 1921, was removed from the archives. And every attempt was made by the citizens of Tulsa to make sure that no one ever heard of what had happened at Greenwood. The pastor of my church lived in Tulsa, Oklahoma, his whole life until he graduated from college. And he learned about the events of Greenwood when he was in his 50s. And so this type of attack was replicated elsewhere, including in an area called Rosewood, Florida. And so this period of our history was marked by almost unimaginable violence designed to try to control a circumstance against all the laws and amendments that had been passed and all of the desire that existed in some places for equity and equality. And the legacy of this time period exists today in our society.